What is your breaking point? That moment when the strength you've maintained through everything, fear, pain, direct threats to your life, simply crumbles because the predator has discovered your only real vulnerability, people you love more than yourself. There comes a specific point where the predator recognizes that its prey is too strong to break directly, that frontal attacks have failed multiple times, that it absorbs every attempt at intimidation and remains steadfast. Then it changes tactics. With surgical precision and calculated cruelty, it doesn't attack you. It attacks the one you love, transforming strength that has always been a shield into exploitable vulnerability, revealing that the strongest person is only as strong as the weakest person they protect. For her, that moment arrived on a Tuesday night, for weeks after entering protective custody. At 11:40, when she was trying to sleep, a generally futile attempt, but a ritual she maintained for the sake of normalcy. The secure phone rang, an unknown number that instinct screamed she shouldn't answer. But cruel curiosity, or perhaps a need to confirm her growing fear, made her answer. Silence. Then a distorted electronic voice, impossible to identify but laden with unmistakable malice. "You can hide. I admit, you're well protected." 2 attempts failed. "You're hard to reach," a deliberate, sadistic pause. "But your sister in Seattle, Emily Rodriguez, 1200 Maple Street. Your 6-year-old nephew, Ethan, who attends Jefferson Elementary. They're not hiding, they're not protected. And you care about them much more than you care about yourself, don't you?" And the world crumbled in a completely new way, far more devastating than any previous threat, because all the terror she had faced in the last few weeks, to assassination attempts that nearly succeeded, constant persecution that turned her life into a sequence of safe houses and guards, and hypervigilance that never switched off, isolation that cut her off from everything familiar, had been about her own survival. Something horrible, but which she could rationalize as a consequence of the choice she made when witnessing an execution. As the price she was willing to pay for doing the right thing. Stay with me until the end. Because what happens next will show you something fundamental about the difference between protecting someone and truly understanding what protection means when the person you love has connections that are inseparable from who they are. Why turn an innocent family into targets simply because of their connection to her? Threaten a 6-year-old child who had absolutely nothing to do with the crime? Testimony, or justice? Use her love for her sister and nephew as a weapon to force compliance? It was an escalation that fundamentally changed everything, turning the protection she had accepted, constant guards, severe restrictions, life suspended indefinitely, into intolerable imprisonment. Because now she had to choose her own safety or the safety of the people she loved more than life itself. Continue cooperating with the investigation, maintain course toward eventual testimony, and watch her family be destroyed as punishment, or disappear completely. Compromise the case, let the murderers escape, betray the system that had risked everything to protect her, but keep her sister and nephew safe through her own sacrifice. There was no good option, only gradations of devastation. And in a moment of brutal clarity, that Tuesday night, with her distorted voice still echoing in her ears and her heart beating so violently it felt like it would explode, she made a decision. The only way to protect Emily and Ethan was to remove herself completely from the equation, to disappear in ways that would make testimony impossible, that would make the criminal organization lose interest, because she would no longer be a threat, even if it meant living on the run permanently, even if it meant never having a normal life again, even if it meant abandoning justice and letting murderers go unpunished. When the alternative was the blood of her 6-year-old nephew on her hands, it wasn't really a choice. It was the only option her conscience allowed. But there was a complication she hadn't fully anticipated. Jake Dawson, the sheriff who had started as her designated protector, but had become so much more through weeks of forced proximity, shared vulnerability, moments where masks fell and real connection emerged. Man who had watched her completely crumble and had held the pieces together without judgment. A person who had become not just a protector, but a partner. Not just an authority figure, but an ally. Not just a constant presence, but someone she had fallen in love with, in ways that complicated absolutely everything. And when Jake discovered, because of course he discovered, because he was observing, really observing in ways that few others did, that she was planning to run away in the middle of the night, disappear without explanation to protect her family through self-sacrifice. He did something no one expected, something that completely changed the dynamic between them and the nature of the threat they faced. He defied superior orders that would have dictated following protocol, letting the system handle things through appropriate channels. He ignored established procedures that existed specifically to prevent officers from exceeding their authority or resources. And he took on alone, without official backup, without authorization, risking the badge he had carried for 22 years, the defense not only of the witness it was his job to protect, but of her entire family. Of a sister she had never met and a nephew she had never seen, against a criminal network that was proving to be far larger and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. An organization that no one in an official position dared to touch because its tentacles penetrated too deeply, into too many places. Because Jake Dawson understood a fundamental truth that most people miss. You can't truly protect someone in isolation. You can't guarantee a person's safety while the people they love are vulnerable. Because humans aren't islands, we are networks of connections. And threatening those connections is threatening the very essence of who we are. So she would never truly be safe, could never bear witness without paralyzing terror, could never live without constantly looking over her shoulder, unless the people she loved were protected too. And that act the choice to protect not only herself, but the entire world that mattered to her. The decision to understand that her safety was inseparable from the safety of her family revealed a depth of commitment that completely transcended professional duty or even nascent romantic feelings. It revealed the character of a man willing to sacrifice career, reputation, possibly freedom, if his actions were criminally prosecuted. To do what he believed was right, even when the system told him to do otherwise. But to fully grasp the magnitude of that decision, to understand why Jake's choice was both heroic and potentially disastrous, you need to know who she was before her world crumbled, before the strength that had always defined her was transformed into exploitable vulnerability through the most cruel tactics predators employ, before everything fell apart, before predators discovered a vulnerability she couldn't defend. She had been exactly the kind of person who prided herself on strength and independence. At 32, she had built her entire identity around being capable, resilient, someone others turned to in crises, but who rarely asked for help herself. Working as a nurse in a community hospital had honed that strength through years of handling emergencies, maintaining composure when patients were dying and families were falling apart, functioning under extreme pressure with an efficiency that colleagues admired. "You never stop," colleagues used to say with a mixture of admiration and concern. "How do you manage to stay calm when everything around you is in chaos?" And she would smile, accept the compliment, never revealing that her calmness was a carefully maintained performance, that at home after those brutal shifts, she would often break down in ways no one witnessed. But these breakdowns were private, controlled, processed alone because she had learned from a young age that dependence was dangerous, that showing vulnerability was an invitation to disappointment. She grew up with that philosophy tattooed on her psyche through experience as a single mother, who raised her and her younger sister alone after her father abandoned the family when she was 8. Never fully explaining why, but leaving a lasting impression that men were unreliable. That building a life depending on someone other than herself was a recipe for heartbreak and shattered stability. "You need to be strong," her mother would say repeatedly. "You need to know how to take care of yourself, because nobody will do it for you. Men will come. Jobs will come. The only constant is yourself." and she had internalized that completely, building an armor of self-sufficiency that served her well through the years nursing school, paid for through multiple jobs, a career built through competence and dedication, a life carefully organized so she would never have to depend on anyone financially or emotionally. If you've ever been the person everyone sees as strong, but who carries the burden alone, because you learned that asking for help is a sign of weakness, share in the comments, because recognizing this pattern is the first step in understanding why the threat to her family was devastating in ways that the threat to herself never was. Because the strength she built was designed to protect her, not the people she loved. And when predators changed their target, that armor became useless, proving inadequate protection against the kind of attack that exploited precisely what she valued most. Her relationship with her younger sister, Emily, was one of the few vulnerabilities she allowed herself. 12 years younger, Emily had been almost like a daughter to her during adolescence, when her mother worked 2 jobs, and the responsibility of caring for a young child often fell to her older sister. They had developed a bond that survived time and geographical distance. Emily eventually moving to Seattle, getting married, having a child, building her own life, but maintaining a connection through weekly phone calls, visits when possible, a kind of relationship that was an emotional anchor she rarely admitted needing, but that was fundamental to her sanity. And Ethan, her 6-year-old nephew, whom she never planned to love so intensely, but who completely stole her heart, a bright, curious child, full of energy and endless questions, who called her favorite aunt even though she was his only aunt, who ran to hug her every time he visited, who had a way of making adult problems seem less oppressive through innocent perspective and uncomplicated joy. There were 2 people in the entire world whom she loved unconditionally, whose instinctive protection extended beyond herself, whose very idea of something happening to them was intolerable, transcending fear for her own safety. And when the criminal organization identified that vulnerability, when they specifically threatened Emily and Ethan with details that proved real surveillance, all the strength she had maintained through weeks of personal terror simply evaporated. If this part touched you in any way, if you recognized this specific terror of loved ones being used as weapons against you, leave a like so I know you're connected to this journey. Because what happened in the hours following that call was a complete collapse of rational logic being replaced by the primal panic of a protector recognizing that they cannot protect, of a strong person discovering the absolute limit of their individual strengths. When she went into protective custody after witnessing a murder, when 2 subsequent attempts to kill her missed by inches and sheer luck, when normal life evaporated and was replaced by the existence of safe houses and constant guards and total isolation, she had processed it as a necessary price, as a consequence of the choice she made to cooperate with the investigation instead of remaining silent. It was horrible, it was terrifying, it was unsustainable in the long run. But it was something she could rationalize because it was about her own survival, about doing the right thing even when it cost her everything. But a threat to Emily and Ethan, that was a completely different category of terror. Because they were innocent in ways she technically wasn't, they had 0 connection to crime beyond being related to her, 0 choice in the matter, 0 ability to protect themselves against an organization that had the resources to operate nationally, and the sophistication to infiltrate agencies that were supposed to protect civilians. And when she had to confront the impossible choice presented by that distorted voice, disappear and jeopardize the case, or stay the course and watch her family be destroyed, she discovered that the strength that had always defined her had absolute limits. She could face her own death with courage. But the idea of her 6-year-old nephew being hurt because of his connection to her, that broke something fundamental, revealing that self-sufficiency was an illusion when there were people she loved more than her own life. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories about moments where individual strength meets its limits, and you discover that protecting those you love sometimes means sacrificing everything, including yourself, Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because what Jake did, when he discovered she was planning to run away, when he understood the magnitude of the impossible choice he faced, will show you something fundamental about the difference between technically protecting someone and fully understanding what protection means when that person has a whole world of connections that are inseparable from who they are. But first, to understand why Jake's decision was both heroic and potentially disastrous, you need to understand exactly what happened that Tuesday night when the phone rang and her world crumbled in a completely new way. When she had to confront the fact that all the strength she had built up throughout her life was inadequate against predators who understood that the most effective way to destroy a strong person is to threaten the people they love. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a brutal difference between intellectually understanding that you are in danger and living with that danger day after day. Between knowing abstractly that murderers want you dead, and waking up each morning calculating whether that day will be your last. Between accepting protection as a temporary necessity and recognizing that the life she knew has permanently ended for her. Those 4 weeks in protection were a devastating lesson in how a person can continue functioning externally while crumbling internally. In how strength can be maintained through sheer willpower until a limit is reached that cannot be crossed. For weeks, 28 days since she witnessed an execution she shouldn't have seen. Since normal life evaporated in an instant and was replaced by the existence of rotating safe houses, constant guards, hypervigilance that never completely switched off, even when she was theoretically safe. 28 days of living with terror as a constant companion, not abstract fear, but concrete knowledge, verified through 2 serious assassination attempts that failed by centimeters and fortuitous timing, proving that the criminal organization wasn't bluffing, that it was willing to invest considerable resources in eliminating her before she could testify. She had learned to live with that fear in ways that surprised her. She accepted that every unfamiliar car was a potential threat until proven otherwise. She internalized that constantly looking over her shoulder wasn't paranoia, but appropriate precaution. She developed the habit of identifying escape routes from any room she entered, of sleeping with a knife under her pillow even with armed guards in the next room, of waking instantly at any unexpected sound, prepared to run or fight. And she had rationalized it all as a consequence of her own choice, as a price she was willing, if not happy, then at least prepared to pay for doing the right thing. She had witnessed murder. She had seen faces, even masked ones. She had heard voices. She had information that could connect a specific crime to a wider organization. And when investigators asked for her cooperation, when they explained the importance of her testimony in building a case that could dismantle an entire criminal operation, she had agreed not because she was a heroine or because she had illusions about the cost, but because the alternative, remaining silent, letting murderers go unpunished, living knowing that she had chosen self-interest over justice, was intolerable to the moral system she had built her entire life around. At 32, she had built her entire identity around being strong, independent, able to handle whatever life threw at her without crumbling or asking for help, which she saw as an admission of weakness. Working as a nurse in a community hospital had honed that strength through years of emergencies where she maintained composure when others panicked. Shifts where she saw death and trauma and shattered families, but kept functioning because patients needed her functional, not emotional. "You're a rock," her supervisor used to say approvingly. "I've never seen you break, no matter how chaotic the shift gets. Where did you learn that resilience?" And she would accept the compliment, never revealing that resilience was a product of a childhood where she learned that vulnerability was a dangerous luxury, that a single mother struggling to keep 2 daughters fed and sheltered didn't have the energy to process childhood emotions, that strength was expectation, not choice. And during 4 weeks of protection, through 2 assassination attempts that nearly succeeded, through constant transfers between safe houses that made it impossible to establish a routine or sense of control, through complete isolation that cut her off from everything familiar, including work she loved and colleagues who had become substitutes for family. She had maintained that strength, that ability to keep functioning even when the world was crumbling. He would wake up each morning, follow an exercise routine that guards allowed in a limited space, eat meals even when his appetite had disappeared, participate in case briefings with focused attention, and answer investigators' questions clearly, even when repetition was exhausting. Outwardly, he was an ideal witness, cooperative, stable, and reliable in ways that made the prosecution confident that eventual testimony would be convincing. But internally, she was paying a price she meticulously hid. Nightmares every night, not vague ones, but high-definition replays of executions she witnessed, of subsequent attempts on her own life, of imagined scenarios where the next attempt would succeed. Panic attacks that she controlled through breathing techniques learned from YouTube videos. Hiding in bathrooms until they passed so that guards wouldn't see weakness. Weight loss, that clothes became looser, but which she attributed to normal stress given the circumstances when questioned. And constant, relentless terror had settled in permanently, not just during moments of obvious danger, but in moments that should have been safe. Eating dinner, and my mind processing that the food could be poisoned. Sleeping, and my body tense, anticipating an invasion. Talking to guards, and calculating if any could be compromised. If the leak that had allowed 2 attempts meant that the threat was not only external but potentially infiltrated the very structure of protection. But she had endured it all because it was about her own survival, about the consequences of a decision she had consciously made. It was horrible, but it was manageable through compartmentalization that years as a nurse had taught her, putting terror in a mental box, closing the lid, functioning despite the weight the box added. But there was a blind spot in her armor, a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated being exploited because she naively believed that criminal organizations operated logically, that targeting a person who had witnessed the crime made tactical sense, but targeting a family that had nothing to do with the crime would be an unnecessary escalation that would only attract more attention from the authorities. She had a younger sister, Emily, 12 years her junior, living in Seattle with her husband and 6-year-old son, Ethan. The age difference meant that during childhood they weren't close in a traditional way. She was a teenager when Emily was a toddler, and was leaving for college when Emily was entering adolescence. But they had developed a real closeness. In adulthood, especially after their parents died in an accident 5 years ago, leaving them as each other's only immediate family. Their relationship was built on weekly phone calls, where they shared everything: work, frustrations, small joys, worries about the future. Visits, whenever possible, were precious precisely because they were rare. This kind of bond survives time and geographical distance because it's built on a shared history of growing up in a family where money was tight but love was abundant, where they learned together that family means being present even when circumstances make it difficult. Emily was someone who knew her completely, not the professional version her colleagues saw, or the strong version she presented to the world, but the real person with insecurities, fears, and dreams she rarely admitted to others. She was her sister, but also her best friend. An emotional anchor that allowed her to process life in ways that the self-sufficient solitude she cultivated would make impossible. And Ethan, her nephew, who was born when she was 26, and who completely stole her heart the moment she held him for the first time. A brilliant, curious child, full of impossible energy and endless questions about how the world worked, who called her favorite aunt with absolute conviction, even though she was his only aunt, who drew pictures for her with dedications in the shaky handwriting of a child learning to write, who had a way of making adult problems seem less oppressive through innocent perspective, and joy uncomplicated by cynicism or fear. There were 2 people in the whole world, 3 if you counted Emily's husband. But he was peripheral compared to the direct bond she had with her sister and nephew, whom she loved unconditionally, without reservation, in ways that transcended carefully cultivated self-sufficiency. It was a vulnerability she allowed, an exception to the rule of never depending on or caring too much, because caring was creating a point of attack. When she went into protection after witnessing a murder, when investigators explained the need to completely cut off contact with everyone from her previous life, she had followed instructions specifically for Emily because they said it would keep her safe. No calls, no traceable communication. The organization can monitor known connections, so complete silence protects the family by denying that there is an active connection. It made tactical sense, and she had followed the rules rigorously for 4 weeks, ignoring even when she desperately longed to hear Emily's voice. Not responding when Emily left worried messages about the sudden silence, enduring isolation because she believed she was keeping her family safe through distance. But predators always find vulnerabilities, and when direct attacks against her repeatedly failed, when it became clear that she was well protected, that the guards were competent, that the secure houses were genuinely secure, that reaching her directly would require resources and risk that the organization was unwilling to invest. After 2 failures, they changed tactics in ways she never anticipated. They shifted from attacking well-protected prey to attacking vulnerable connections that the prey loved more than their own lives, revealing that no matter how strong you are individually, no matter how much protection you have, if there are people you love, there is leverage that can be used against you in ways that individual strength cannot defend against. Comment below. This makes sense to me when a predator discovers that attacking you directly doesn't work, but that threatening someone you love instantly breaks you. Individual strength proves inadequate against a type of cruelty that transforms love into vulnerability. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment when abstract terror, the knowledge that you are in danger, the awareness that killers want you dead, transforms into visceral and immediate horror when the threat is no longer just about you but about people you would protect with your own life if you could. When an impossible choice is presented with brutal clarity and a deadline that allows no rationalization or hope that perhaps it's a bluff. For her, that moment arrived on a Tuesday night that began like any other night in recent weeks: familiar insomnia, a futile attempt to sleep, an exhausted body, but a hyper-alert mind, and ended with the world crumbling in a completely new way. The call came at 11:40, a time that, in retrospect, seemed deliberately chosen to maximize psychological impact, late enough that defenses were low from exhaustion, early enough that she wasn't completely asleep, a moment when the mind is in limbo between wakefulness and unconsciousness, most vulnerable to shock and terror. The secure phone that federal authorities had provided, a device that technicians assured was impossible to trace or hack, which should only ring with calls from investigators or designated guards, began to vibrate and ring with an insistence that made her heart leap even before she could process why it was wrong. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Unidentified, not saved among the limited contacts he had. It shouldn't have been possible, given the security protocols in place. An instinct honed through 4 weeks of constant hypervigilance, of learning that anomalies were generally threats, screamed not to answer, to call guards immediately, to treat it as the security breach that it technically was. But curiosity won out, or perhaps it was a need to confirm the growing fear she had begun to feel in the last few hours. An inexplicable sensation that something was wrong in ways she couldn't articulate, but that her body recognized on a primal level. She slid to answer, bringing the phone to her ear, with a hand that was already beginning to tremble. "Hello," a cautious voice, heavy with the tension of someone who knows they are making a mistake but can't resist the need to know. Silence for a moment that lasted an eternity, not empty silence, but silence charged with presence, with the almost imperceptible sound of breathing being processed through software, with a quality that made her skin crawl, in a primal response to danger. Then a voice, electrically distorted by a modulator, that made it impossible to identify as male or female, young or old, but which carried unmistakable malice, the cruel satisfaction of a predator who knows he has his prey cornered. "You are well protected," the voice began, its tone almost conversational, if it weren't for the electronic distortion that transformed it into something inhuman, terrifying. I have to admit this. 2 attempts failed. Guards are competent. Secure houses are genuinely secure. You are difficult to reach. A deliberate, sadistic pause, letting the words sink in, letting her begin to process the implications. But her sister, Emily Rodriguez, residing at 1200 Maple Street in Seattle, Washington, apartment to be on the 2nd floor of the red brick building. She's not protected. She has no guards, no security measures beyond a standard lock that a 12-year-old could force. Instant, complete, paralyzing terror flooded her system. Not abstract terror, but visceral, primal fear. The fear of a predator identifying a vulnerability it cannot defend, of strength being transformed into weakness through a tactic she hadn't anticipated. "And your nephew," the voice continued, clearly enjoying a reaction he didn't need to see to know he was provoking. "Ethan Rodriguez, 6 years old, attends Jefferson Elementary School. Teacher Ms. Martinez, room 14. He walks 3 blocks to school every morning at 8:15. Alone for the last 2 weeks because his mother started a new job with earlier hours. Lovely child. It would be a shame if something happened to him." No. The word came out as a strangled scream. Unable to form a complete thought, only a visceral denial of the horror being described. No. They have nothing to do with this. They are innocent. They are all connected. The voice cut off coldly, the distortion betraying a calculated cruelty. Because you care about them. More than you care about yourself. Clearly. And as long as you care, as long as your sister and nephew exists as leverage points, we're in control. Simple as that. Her mind was racing, processing details that proved it wasn't an empty bluff. Emily's specific address, including apartment number, Ethan's school name and teacher, knowledge of a morning routine that had only recently changed. This required real vigilance, sustained observation, resources invested in monitoring family that was supposedly safe through distance and lack of contact. "So here's your choice," the voice continued, delivering the ultimatum with brutal efficiency. "You disappear. Completely. Stop cooperating with the federal investigation. Never testify. We live happily ever after, knowing you chose wisdom over stubbornness." Or, a heavy pause. "You stay the course. Continue cooperating. Eventually, testify. And your family pays the price for your stubbornness. Starting with the child, because the psychological impact on you would be more devastating." Words caught in my throat, my mind struggling to process the impossibility of choice presented to me. They are innocent. Completely innocent. They did nothing more than be related to me. And you were innocent too. The voice replied with an indifference that was more terrifying than anger would have been. "You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You witnessed something you shouldn't have. Life is unfair in that way. Innocent people suffer the consequences of choices their own or others. It's a reality that everyone eventually learns." Silence fell as he let it sink in. "Then, you have 48 hours to decide and demonstrate your decision through actions. Your family or your testimony. Abstract justice, or the flesh and blood people you love. Choose wisely, because there will be no second chance." The call ended with a definitive click, leaving her in a silence that was deafening compared to the distorted voice. She stood paralyzed for a moment that could have been seconds or minutes. The phone still pressed against her ear, her mind trying to process the absolute horror of what she had just heard. It wasn't a bluff. Every instinct, every experience of 4 weeks living under constant threat, every lesson learned through 2 serious assassination attempts screamed that the threat was real and would be carried out if she didn't comply. Details were too specific to be invented or guessed. The organization had identified Emily and Ethan, had placed surveillance on them, had mapped their routines and vulnerabilities, and was ready to escalate from threat to action if she didn't comply. The choice presented was impossible in ways that cut deeper than any personal threat could have, Because when it came to personal survival, one could rationalize continuing doing the right thing, cooperating justly, accepting risk as a consequence of a moral decision. But this, choosing between abstract justice and the life of a 6-year-old child, between doing the right thing and protecting a nephew whom one loved more than any principle. Compromising the case meant letting the murderers escape, betraying a system that had risked considerable resources to protect her, abandoning the justice that the original witnessed, the executed man she had seen die deserved. It meant that his death would be meaningless, that the organization would continue operating, that future crimes would not be prevented. But staying the course meant watching Emily be threatened, possibly hurt or killed. It meant Ethan, a 6-year-old boy, with a smile that lit up any room, with an innocence that still believed the world was fundamentally good, being used as a pawn in a brutal game where his life was merely a tactic to force her compliance. There was no good option, only gradations of devastation, a choice between betraying principles or betraying people. And in a moment of brutal clarity, sitting in the darkness of a safe house that now felt like a prison instead of a refuge, she understood with absolute certainty the only way to protect Emily and Ethan was to remove herself completely from the equation, to disappear in ways that would make testimony impossible, that would eliminate her value to the investigation, that would make the organization lose interest because she would no longer be a threat, even if it meant living on the run permanently, even if it meant never returning to a normal life, never resuming her career, never having stability or security. Even if it meant abandoning justice, letting murderers go unpunished, betraying the trust of investigators who had invested in protecting her, when the alternative was the blood of her 6-year-old nephew on her hands. When the choice was between abstract principles and the concrete life of an innocent child, it wasn't really a choice. It was a painful inevitability that cracked something fundamental in her soul. But it was the only option that her conscience allowed. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a specific skill that comes from years in law enforcement, from observing people under extreme stress and learning to read not only what they say, but what they hide, not just obvious expressions, but micro-signals that reveal truths that words try to mask. For Jake Dawson, that skill had been honed through 22 years, dealing with traumatized witnesses, lying suspects, victims hiding fear. And in the 5 weeks protecting her, he had learned her specific language, every nuance, every pattern, every sign of when she was truly okay versus when she was performing composure. Then he recognized a change in her immediately the morning after the threat, the moment she emerged from the safe house where they had been isolating for the past 2 weeks. Something fundamental had shifted overnight in ways that went far beyond a bad night's sleep or the accumulated stress he had seen build up over weeks. It wasn't just mood or energy, it was the complete quality of her presence, how she occupied space, how she interacted, or specifically, how she avoided interacting. His body language was off in subtle but unmistakable ways. Shoulders were too tense, his posture defensive, as if expecting verbal or physical attack. His movements were mechanical rather than natural, as if operating on autopilot while his mind was completely occupied processing something else. And crucially, he avoided eye contact, not occasionally, but consistently, looking at everything except directly at Jake in ways that were deliberate choice, not natural shyness. And there was a quality of quietude that was fundamentally different from the normal contemplation or introversion she often displayed after difficult nights. It was the quietude of someone who had made a significant decision and was hiding that decision, who was processing not options but a plan already formed, who was mentally committed to a course of action that she knew others would question. In 5 weeks of protecting her, weeks that had evolved from purely professional to something much more personal, where he had learned not only safety protocols but also her emotional nuances, Jake had developed an almost intuitive ability to read her states. He knew when nightmares were bad versus manageable, based on how long it took her to leave the room. The quality of her dark circles, whether she would accept coffee or needed time before being ready to interact. He knew when hypervigilance was an appropriate response to genuine stimulus versus heightened paranoia that needed to be gently recalibrated through factual reassurance. He knew when she needed space to process alone versus when she needed his presence even if she didn't explicitly ask for it. And he immediately recognized that what he was seeing now was in a completely different category, not stress or fear or trauma processing, but a decision made, a plan formed, something he had been actively hiding. What happened? It wasn't a casual question asked out of politeness. It was a gentle but direct interrogation from someone who knew with absolute certainty which answer mattered, that something significant had changed overnight, and that understanding what it was critical. Nothing. The answer came too quickly, too defensively. I just didn't sleep well. Bad nightmares. Normal given the circumstances. A transparent lie, or at least a truth so incomplete that it functioned as a lie. Jake had seen her after sleepless nights. He had carried her through multiple nights where nightmares were so intense she would wake screaming, where he had to remind her where she was and that she was safe, where it took hours for her breathing to normalize. This was different. It wasn't exhaustion from trauma reprocessed during sleep. It was something more deliberate, more focused. Don't lie to me. A firm but not hostile, not accusatory voice. A statement of expectation based on the trust they had built. Whatever happened, we can handle it together. But I can't help if I don't know what we're facing. She hesitated, processing how much to reveal, weighing the risks of honesty versus evasion. And she chose middle ground, a partial truth that technically wasn't a lie, but omitted a crucial core. Just processing how long this will last. Whether life will ever go back to normal, or if this is permanent now. Thoughts I have often, but that were particularly intense last night. Technically, true, she was definitely processing the future. But not entirely true, and Jake recognized the omission through the way words were delivered, through how she still avoided direct eye contact. He let it go momentarily, because forcing a confrontation when she was clearly not ready for complete honesty would be counterproductive. But he dramatically increased surveillance, not just external surveillance, as he always did, checking the perimeter and potential threats, but internal surveillance, observing her as closely as he observed the surrounding environment. And throughout the day, a pattern emerged that confirmed the initial suspicion. She was planning something, not just thinking about the future abstractly, but actively preparing for a specific action. She checked exit routes multiple times, not casually, but systematically, memorizing paths, calculating the time it would take to reach a door, a window, any exit point. She packed belongings in a way that was too organized to be casual, maintenance not reorganizing but consolidating, minimizing, preparing for quick movement. And when she said goodnight, there was a quality of purpose in her voice, the way she held eye contact for an extra moment, as if memorizing his face, as if she didn't expect to see him in the morning. Jake had seen enough behavior in his 22-year career to recognize a pattern. She was planning to run away. And when he discreetly checked, not maliciously invading her privacy, but performing the security checks his role allowed, and the circumstances demanded, he discovered evidence that confirmed it. Her secure phone had a record of an incoming call at 11:42. The previous night from an unauthorized number. A security breach that should have been technically impossible, given the encryption and protocols, but which had obviously occurred. And the timing shortly before, a dramatic change in her behavior, suggested a causal connection. Someone had caught up with her, had said something, and that had triggered her decision to flee. Jake didn't confront her immediately, because he needed to understand the full scope before acting. He needed to know, not only what she was planning, but why. What had been said that turned a cooperative witness into someone preparing a desperate escape. So he waited, keeping watch, allowing her to think about what plan was working. And when 2 in the morning arrived, when he heard her bedroom door open with an exaggerated quietness, as if trying not to be heard. When he saw through the partial darkness, Jake never slept deeply at work. He remained conscious, even at rest. Her move towards the exit with her backpack ready. On her back, Jake finally intervened. "Where are you going?" A voice from the darkness, calm but imbued with authority, made her jump violently, almost dropping her backpack. "Jake, I didn't know you were awake. I need to get out. Just for a while." Fresh air, clear head, an attempt to normalize what was obviously abnormal. In the middle of the night, without alerting the guards, without an escort, with her backpack packed. He turned on the light, revealing not only her caught red-handed, but also the expression on her face. This isn't a night stroll. It's an escape. And to escape now, alone, without protection. That's suicide. He saw her expression transform from guilt at being caught to something deeper, the despair of someone with no good options, only a choice between different devastations. It wasn't the expression of someone being irrational. It was the expression of someone who had calculated the odds and decided that her own death was preferable to the alternative. "What happened?" He repeated the question, but this time it wasn't a gentle interrogation. It was a demand for complete honesty. The truth this time. The whole truth. And it was despair in her eyes. The realization that she couldn't do this alone, but also couldn't involve him without putting him at risk. That finally broke her last resistance and caused words to gush out in a torrent that had been held back for hours. "They threatened Emily, my sister, my 6-year-old nephew. They called last night. They have his exact address, his school, his complete routine. They said that if she doesn't disappear, if she continues cooperating with the investigation, the family will pay the price. Starting with Ethan because the psychological impact would be worse." She paused to breathe, her words racing in panic. "And I won't let a 6-year-old child die or be hurt because of a choice I made. So I need to go. I need to disappear completely, compromise the case, give impossible testimony so there's no reason to hurt them. It's the only way to keep them safe." And Jake, hearing that, processing the magnitude instantly, understood multiple things simultaneously. Why she was running away wasn't irrational, but a logical response to an impossible threat. What organization had changed tactics from attacking a well-protected witness to attacking a vulnerable family? What protection system had failed to anticipate or prevent that escalation? That her decision to run away, while understandable, wouldn't solve the problem, but only delay the inevitable. And the only way to truly protect her was not to keep her safe in isolation, but to protect the entire world that mattered to her. Because predators always find leverage, and the only true defense is to remove that leverage, protecting not only the individual but everyone connected to them. Comment below. This makes sense to me when you recognize that the person you are protecting is planning to flee, not out of cowardice but out of desperate love for their family. The only moral response is to expand protection to include everyone they love. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment in any relationship, especially one born in extreme circumstances, where a person has a choice between following protocol that protects career and reputation, but fails the person they care about, or breaking all the rules to do what they believe is morally necessary, even when the cost will be devastating. For Jake, that moment arrived at 2:07 a.m. on a Wednesday, standing in the safe house with her crumbling, explaining why she had to run away. And the decision he made in seconds changed not only the trajectory of their affair, but the entire nature of their relationship. Jake didn't try to convince her she was being irrational, didn't offer comforting platitudes about how the system would protect family, didn't downplay the threat or suggest she was exaggerating her fear, because she was right, objectively, verifiably right. The witness protection system wasn't equipped to protect extended family in another state, especially when the threat was an organization with demonstrated resources to operate nationally, sophisticated enough to infiltrate supposedly secure communications, and with a proven willingness, through 2 serious assassination attempts, to escalate to violence when necessary. Official protocol would dictate reporting threats through appropriate channels, allowing federal investigators to decide resource allocation based on standardized risk assessment, and following a chain of command specifically designed to prevent individual officers from exceeding their authority or making promises the system could not keep. Protocol would also state that decisions regarding extended family protection were not the prerogative of the local sheriff but of federal agencies with appropriate jurisdiction and resources. But protocol had already failed multiple times. It had failed to prevent a secure phone from being compromised. It had failed to anticipate that the organization would change tactics from attacking a witness to attacking a family member. It had failed in 2 previous attempts that nearly killed her. And Jake had stopped blindly trusting the system weeks ago when it became clear that there were leaks. That corruption penetrated deeper than superficially apparent, that rigidly following protocol often meant arriving too late. "You're not going to run away," he said, not as an authoritarian command from an officer giving orders, but as a statement of fact, as a promise that an alternative existed even if she couldn't see it in that moment of panic. Because running away doesn't protect family. It only postpones the inevitable. The organization still knows where they are. They still use that as leverage to force you to eventually return. Or worse, they hurt you just in retaliation for having run away. So what do I do? Absolute despair echoed in her voice, a complete breakdown of the strength she had maintained for weeks. How do I keep a 6-year-old child safe from professional assassins with resources that exceed anything I have? I don't have the money to hire private protection. I don't have the connections to hide them. I don't have the power to make the system prioritize their safety when it's overwhelmed, inadequately protecting only me. So what's left but to remove myself from the equation? We protect them. Simple, direct, delivered with absolute conviction that allowed no doubt or discussion. How? Not skepticism, but the desperation of someone wanting to believe, but seeing no possible way out. I'm bringing your sister and nephew here, to our jurisdiction, to an area where I can directly protect them, instead of relying on coordination with other agencies. Jake was already mentally processing logistics, as he explained. I established discreet but effective protection, not official safe houses that the organization can track through leaks, but locations that only I know. And we force the organization to recalculate. Because targets that were easy have become difficult. Because concentration instead of dispersion means I can adequately defend everyone. She processed it, finally managing to engage with possibility instead of just panic, but looking for flaws, because years of self-sufficiency had taught her not to trust solutions that seemed to simple. This requires significant resources: transportation, accommodation, food for 3 additional people. It requires authorization from multiple agencies, because it's moving civilians across state lines for protection purposes. It requires coordination with Seattle PD, with federal agents, with your superiors, and everyone is overwhelmed with the current case. No one will approve a dramatic expansion of scope when budgets are already tight, so I don't ask for approval. The decision had already been made, delivered with a finality that left no room for argument. I do it because it's necessary, and because it's morally right. I'll face the consequences later, when everyone is safe. Jake? No. A different kind of panic, no, not for herself, but for him. This would destroy your career. Superiors won't tolerate an officer acting unilaterally, massively exceeding authority, using unauthorized resources. You've already risked too much for me. I can't let you sacrifice the badge you've carried for 22 years, and I would risk it all again. He moved to hold her shoulders, forcing her to stop avoiding eye contact, to look directly at him as he spoke his next words. Because you'll never truly be safe, not physically but psychologically. Not technically but emotionally. You'll never be able to witness, without paralyzing terror, that family pays a price if the people you love are vulnerable. So we eliminate vulnerability. We protect not only you, but everyone who matters to you. Pause, letting it sink in. And if that means going against direct orders from superiors, ignoring protocol that exists for valid reasons, but is inadequate for this specific situation, risking the badge I've worn for 22 years, and that completely defines my professional identity, then that's what I do, without hesitation, without regret. It was that moment, Jake, choosing to protect not only her, but the entire world that mattered to her, choosing to understand that her safety wasn't just about keeping her physical body intact, but about preserving her mental sanity and ability to testify without psychological collapse, including the safety of her sister and nephew, whom she loved more than her own life. That fundamentally changed the dynamic between them in ways that completely transcended their origins as protector and protected. Because he was no longer fulfilling a professional duty to protect a designated witness, he was making a profound personal choice to protect someone who had become more important than his career, more important than his badge, more important than his own safety or convenience. And by extension, he was choosing to protect everyone that person loved. Because he understood a truth that most people miss. You can't separate a person from their connections. You can't truly protect someone while the people they love are threatened. And she, seeing that, processing the full magnitude of what he was offering to sacrifice, not because he had to, but because he chose to, felt something irreversibly change within her. It was no longer simple gratitude for the protection she was receiving. It was no longer appreciation for his professional competence or the comfort of his constant presence during impossible weeks. It was love not born of dependence or trauma bonding or confusion of intense feelings in extreme circumstances, but genuine love born of recognition of character revealed through impossible choices. Because Jake saw her completely, not just as a witness in a case he was working on, not just as someone he had developed feelings for during weeks of forced proximity, but as a complete human being with a network of connections and responsibilities and people she couldn't abandon, even to save her own life. And he was willing to protect all of that. He was willing to expand his circle of protection to include a sister he had never met and a nephew he had never seen. He was willing to risk his career, reputation, and the badge that defined him, because he understood that protecting her meant protecting her world. Because he loved her enough to value her mental health and peace more than his own convenience or professional security. Why? The question came out as a whisper, not out of doubt, but out of a need to hear an articulated reason, to understand the motivation that was leading him to risk everything. Because I love you. Simple, honest, without elaboration or qualification. Not just as someone who is protecting you or as someone I developed feelings for during extreme circumstances, but as someone I want a future with, someone I want to see safe and whole and able to live without constant terror. And that future is not possible if the family you love is threatened, if every day is a calculation of whether they are safe. Pause. Vulnerability, penetrating, certainty. And if I love you, then I protect what you love. Because your pain is my pain. Your terror is my terror. And the idea of you having to choose between justice and family, between doing the right thing and protecting a child, is intolerable in ways that transcend any consideration of career. And at that moment, standing in the safe house at 2 a.m. with her backpack still on her back and a completely uncertain future, they both understood that the line between professional and personal had not only been crossed but completely obliterated, that what existed between them was real, in ways that would survive scrutiny and judgment, because it was built not on convenience or circumstance, but on impossible choices where they both chose each other over safer alternatives. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because there is a devastating difference between making a heroic decision in the heat of the moment, based on moral conviction, and living with that decision when reality reveals that you dramatically underestimated your adversary, that the resources you have are inadequate, that the promise you made may be impossible to keep. For Jake, that realization came not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a gradual accumulation of signs over the first few days after bringing Emily and Ethan into the cabin. Each sign revealing that the organization he faced was far more formidable and dangerous than intelligence had suggested. Jake acted immediately after the decision was made, not waiting for approval through official channels that he knew wouldn't come because superiors would say he was massively exceeding his authority. That extended family protection wasn't his responsibility, that resources were limited and already stretched protecting the key witness. So he bypassed the system completely and operated through the informal network he had built over 22 years. He called his contact in Seattle, Detective Mike Chen, to whom he owed a significant favor from a case years ago where Jake had shared critical information that resulted in Chen's promotion, and explained the situation with brutal honesty, making no attempt to downplay its gravity or hide the fact that he was operating without official authorization. I need discreet protection for two people. The sister of a federal witness and her 6-year-old son. The threat is real, verified. The organization is sophisticated with national resources. I don't have official authorization. But the situation is critical. The child is threatened and the system isn't responding adequately. Contact hesitated only. A moment not for lack of willingness, but processing the implications of assisting an unsanctioned operation. Send details. I can provide discreet cover for 48 hours, until you can get here and establish something more permanent. After that, I need explanations that I can give to superiors if they ask. Jake coordinated logistics with an efficiency born from decades of doing similar work. But this time the weight was different, because it wasn't an official operation with backup and resources, but a personal undertaking, where failure would mean not only a compromised case, but innocent people dead. And she watched as he worked the phone, making calls, calling in favors, building a safety net through back channels. Impressed and simultaneously terrified by the speed with which he was irrevocably compromising himself. Within 6 hours, Emily and Ethan were under discreet surveillance in Seattle, an unmarked car parked within sight of their apartment, their routine monitored to identify vulnerabilities, Chen personally checking for security. Within 12 hours, they were on a flight to Jake's state with an unofficial escort, Chen personally accompanying them under the pretense of visiting family, ensuring there was no tail or threat during their more vulnerable transit. And within 18 hours, they were on rural property that Jake had prepared, not an official safe house that would be on records that could be leaked and compromised, but a secondary cabin that his family owned through a trust that didn't directly connect to his name. A location that no one besides him, and perhaps a distant cousin who never visited, knew, isolated by miles of dense forest, making undetected approach difficult. The reunion between the sisters was emotional in ways that Jake observed from a respectful distance, allowing for a private moment while maintaining perimeter vigilance because danger didn't pause for feelings. She embraced Emily, whom she hadn't seen in months, her younger sister who had become as important as anyone else in her life, a connection that had kept her sanity alive through difficult years. She picked up Ethan, who had visibly grown since her last visit, her nephew who shouted "Auntie," with the uncomplicated joy of a child who didn't understand danger but who trusted absolutely that adults would keep them safe. "Why didn't you call?" Emily asked as soon as the hug loosened. Worry and relief mixed together. "I was terrified when you disappeared." Without explanation. "I thought something had happened." "Something happened," she admitted, choosing her words carefully because Ethan was listening with the curiosity of a 6-year-old. "They need to stay with me for a while. It's a complicated situation, but they're safe now." Sheriff Dawson assured me of that. Emily, always more perceptive than her delicate appearance suggested, always able to read her older sister, even through her evasions, looked beyond words for the truth. "This is about what you witnessed, isn't it? Dangerous people know about us. We're in danger because of you." It wasn't an accusation, although the words could be interpreted that way. It was a confirmation of a fear that had been growing since her sister's sudden silence. An attempt to understand a situation that was being presented in vague terms. Not because of me, she corrected firmly. Because blame was tempting, but inaccurate. Because of criminals who prefer to threaten innocent people rather than face justice, who use people I love as leverage, because attacking me directly didn't work. But they're safe now. Sheriff Dawson has taken personal protection. Emily turned her attention to Jake, who was discreetly checking windows while seemingly offering privacy. A younger sister's assessment of a man in her older sister's life. A gaze searching for character, motivation, and reliability. And who guarantees his safety? Why take on this protecting people you don't even know against an organization you described as having the resources to threaten nationally? That's beyond duty. That's a choice that costs something. Yes, she admitted quietly, looking at Jake with an expression that Emily instantly read through sisterly bond. But he chose to do it anyway. And it was at that moment seeing Jake crouch down to Ethan's level as a child and ask with unfiltered curiosity, "Why do we have to stay here?" Explaining in simple terms that family needs to stay together for a while, and I'll keep everyone safe. Offering reassurance without condescending or lying about seriousness, but also without scaring, that she fully understood the depth of what he had undertaken. He wasn't just protecting her as a witness, which was his job to keep alive for trial. He wasn't just fulfilling his duty or following expanded protocol. He was protecting the entire world that mattered to her, because he understood a fundamental truth that most people miss. Her safety wasn't just physical, but emotional. It wasn't just about keeping her body intact, but about preserving her sanity. And that sanity was inseparable from knowing that the people she loved were safe. The first 36 hours were tense but manageable. Jake established a perimeter, taught Emily basic safety procedures, created evacuation plans that included Ethan without scaring him by presenting them as adventure games. Food was prepared, a routine was established, and an appearance of normalcy was built upon a foundation of constant vigilance. But the organization did not back down in the face of Jake's escalation to consolidate all targets in a protected location. Instead, they responded with their own escalation, which revealed a depth of resources and connections that official intelligence had dramatically underestimated. 2 days after Emily and Ethan arrived, signs began to appear. Unknown figures in the cabin perimeter, not approaching but observing from a distance through trees. Movements detected only because Jake knew exactly what to look for. A presence that indicated professional, not amateur, surveillance. Drones making aerial passes small, commercially available but operated with precision that suggested training, mapping, property layout, and identifying vulnerabilities. Even more worrying, signs that the location had been compromised through means Jake hadn't anticipated, possible vehicle tracking through technology that wasn't on his radar, or information infiltration through Chen or another contact Jake had trusted, or simply surveillance capabilities so extensive that consolidating them all into one location made identification easier, not harder. Jake understood with growing horror. He had dramatically underestimated how deep and well-connected the organization was. It wasn't a local criminal network with resources limited to the metropolitan area. It was an operation with tentacles in multiple states, capable of mobilizing sophisticated surveillance, with corruption infiltrating. Agencies that should have been on their side, with tracking and threat capabilities that exceeded anything intelligence briefings had suggested. Jake had essentially brought a knife to the shootout. And now he had not only her, but Emily and Ethan's sister, and 6-year-old child under protection, in a location that was being discovered. With limited resources as a lone man, without official backup because the entire operation was unsanctioned, against an adversary who was proving to be far more formidable and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When a promise to protect your opponent is met with the reality of a far more powerful adversary than anticipated, And you have to decide whether to back down or double down, even when the odds are impossible. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific kind of torture that comes from making a decision based on absolute moral conviction, committing oneself irreversibly, and then confronting the growing possibility that judgment was wrong. That heroism was actually hubris, that a promise made with total sincerity might be impossible to keep, not for lack of will, but for a fundamental failure to assess one's adversary and one's own limitations. For Jake, that torture began on the second night after Emily and Ethan arrived, when everyone was asleep and he had the mental space to process the full magnitude of what he had done and what he was facing. That night, after Emily and Ethan had fallen asleep, child collapsing from exhaustion from the journey and the move, sister following after checking multiple times that the doors were locked and Jake was actually keeping watch, so she finally relaxed, minimally, for the first time in days, knowing that family was physically close. Instead of vulnerable and distant, Jake sat alone on the small cabin balcony, processing with brutal honesty what solitude and darkness allowed. He had violated virtually every established protocol that existed specifically to prevent exactly the type of situation he had created. He had used official resources, contacts, information, secure communication systems for unauthorized purposes that superiors would characterize as abuse of authority. He had moved civilians across state lines for protection purposes without proper authorization, without coordination with relevant agencies, without the oversight that existed to prevent exactly the type of rogue operation he was conducting. He had essentially kidnapped a federal witness who was under official protection and her family, completely removing them from proper chain of custody and taking them to a location known only to him in ways that, if objectively reviewed by an ethics investigator or prosecutor seeking to build a case, would appear not as protection, but as deliberate isolation that eliminated accountability and created a situation where he had absolute control over vulnerable individuals, if actions were objectively reviewed. Not by someone who knew the emotional context or motivation, but by a committee strictly applying rules. They would appear reckless at best, potentially criminal at worst. One could face not only loss of badge but formal charges of kidnapping, compromising a federal investigation, and endangering civilians through unauthorized actions, and he could no longer rationalize it as a sound, tactical decision based on superior situational assessment, because it was becoming painfully clear that he had dramatically underestimated the threat. Official intelligence had characterized the organization as a regional criminal network, with resources limited primarily to the metropolitan area, but the surveillance it was detecting multiple figures in the perimeter. Drones with capabilities suggesting not cheap commercial equipment, but near military hardware. Location tracking capabilities that should have been unknown revealed a much larger, much more sophisticated, much more dangerous operation. The organization wasn't just local criminals. It was a network with tentacles in multiple states, with the resources to rapidly mobilize professional surveillance, with connections deep enough that leaks to official agencies weren't an aberration but systematic infiltration, and with a demonstrated willingness to escalate to violence that included threatening a 6-year-old child. And Jake had consolidated all the targets, primary witness, sister, nephew, in a single location that was being uncovered. Operating alone, without official backup, with limited single-man resources against what was proving to be an organization with near paramilitary capabilities. It had potentially put everyone in greater danger, not least through a decision that seemed morally necessary but which tactically could be disastrous. Because dispersion at least meant that the organization had to divide resources, that attacking multiple targets simultaneously was logistically complex. But consolidation meant that it could concentrate force in a single location, that one operation would eliminate all witnesses and leverage simultaneously. Jake had gambled everything, a career that had defined him for 22 years, a reputation meticulously built as a competent and ethical officer, a badge he wore with pride. Potential freedom if his actions were characterized as criminal, rather than misjudged on a bet that he could protect everyone better than the system could, and the bet was proving to have much worse odds than I had calculated at the moment of decision, when moral conviction had overridden careful tactical analysis. The question that haunted him, that swirled repeatedly in his mind during silent hours of vigil, when there was no distraction to escape brutal self-examination, was no longer whether he had done morally right. It was whether he had condemned everyone, herself, Emily, Ethan, possibly himself, through miscalculated heroism that confused moral conviction with tactical competence. Because there were times when doing what you believe is right transcends professional considerations, when moral conviction outweighs protocol and procedure, and even pragmatic assessment of odds. And Jake had crossed that point without real hesitation, because the alternative presented, letting her run away alone where she would be vulnerable and isolated, or keeping her while her family remained exposed and threatened, or following a protocol that had already failed multiple times, and magically expecting a different outcome was intolerable. To watch her being destroyed, not physically but psychologically, through constant terror at the hands of her family, or worse, to watch her family actually being hurt while he followed rules that existed to protect the system, not people, that transcended what his conscience could accept. It was a line he couldn't cross, even when crossing it meant following orders and protecting his career. But moral conviction did not guarantee tactical competence. Doing what he believed was right did not mean he was capable of executing what he promised. And now he faced the growing, terrifying possibility that a promise made with absolute sincerity, "I will protect you and your family," might be impossible to keep. Not for lack of will or commitment, but for a fundamental failure to assess his opponent and his own limitations. Protecting her alone had been a significant challenge that she nearly failed twice. But protecting her, plus her 6-year-old younger sister, a child who didn't understand danger, who needed not only physical protection, but emotional stability, and whom Jake had zero experience caring for against an organization that was proving to have resources and sophistication that dramatically exceeded what intelligence suggested. That was beyond the reasonable capacity of a single officer, especially operating without official backup, particularly when leaks had demonstrated that relying on the system was dangerous. Jake had experience in protection. He had training in defensive tactics. He had a network of contacts he could call in for favors. But he didn't have a private army. He didn't have unlimited resources. He didn't have the capacity to maintain 24/7 surveillance indefinitely, without sleep or making mistakes due to exhaustion. He didn't have a way to prevent an organization with superior resources from eventually overcoming defenses through attrition, if nothing else. And there was a 6-year-old child whose safety now depended on his competence. An absolute innocent who had no choice in the situation, who trusted adults implicitly because that's what children do. If something happened to Ethan, if surveillance turned into attack, if defenses were breached, if Jake failed to protect, that would be on his conscience for the rest of his life, which could be very short if the organization decided to eliminate all witnesses simultaneously. He wanted to believe he had done the right thing. He wanted to believe that consolidating protection was a superior tactic, that his love for her justified the risk, that the promise he made would be kept through pure will and commitment. But wanting didn't make it true. And sitting in darkness with the sounds of the forest all around, and the weight of impossible responsibility on his shoulders, Jake confronted a possibility he had avoided, that well-intentioned heroism could result in tragedy, that doing what he believed to be morally necessary didn't guarantee success, that everyone under his protection could pay the price for his judgment being wrong. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a specific moment in a relationship, born in crisis, where a person has to decide whether to reveal complete vulnerability, admit fear, confess doubt, acknowledge they may have failed, risking destroying the image of a strong protector that the other person depends on, or maintain the facade even when the facade is cracking under the weight of impossible responsibility. For Jake, that moment arrived on the third night after Emily and Ethan arrived, when the tension of keeping everyone safe against an adversary who surpassed his resources was becoming unsustainable to bear alone. She found Jake on the porch at 2:30 in the morning, an hour that had become his ritual of solitary vigil while others slept. She saw tension in his shoulders that she instantly recognized as the weight of responsibility, not temporary stress, but accumulated burden that was beginning to bend his posture, transforming the man who always seemed in control into someone operating at the limit of his capacity. She sat beside him without initially speaking, her presence offering a quiet comfort that she had learned over weeks was sometimes more valuable than words. They remained in stillness for minutes, the sounds of the night forest surrounding them, until she finally broke the silence. "You're questioning." It wasn't a question, but an observation based on growing knowledge of his body language, of patterns that indicated when he was processing versus when he was tormented by doubt. "Did I do the right thing bringing them here?" Jake admitted with brutal honesty that he hadn't offered anyone else, a vulnerability that his badge usually didn't allow, but that the weight of isolation made necessary. "Did I put everyone in more danger instead of less by consolidating targets? Was the promise I made heroism or hubris that will cost lives?" "You did the only right thing," she replied with absolute conviction that admitted no doubt. "The only thing that could keep everyone safe. Because the alternative, letting me escape alone, or keeping me here while my family was exposed, weren't real options. They were just different forms of devastation. I don't know if I can keep the promise I made." The admission came at a profound cost, revealing a crack in trust that Jake rarely showed. The organization is much larger than intelligence indicated. More connected, more sophisticated, more willing to escalate. And I'm essentially alone against a man with limited resources, trying to protect 3 people against a network with near military capabilities. "You're not alone." She took his hand, intertwining their fingers with a firmness that was a physical anchor. "We're in this together. We always have been, but now it's explicit. And Emily is strong, much stronger than her delicate appearance suggests. She survived losing her parents, raising a child essentially alone when marriage became difficult. She can handle this if we give her honesty instead of condescending protection." Pause. Decision being made. "And I can help. I'm not a helpless victim who needs to be passively protected. I have years of medical trauma training. I can handle injuries if something happens. I have strength that I've maintained through impossible weeks. Don't underestimate me. Because I need protection. Needing help isn't the same as being powerless." "I don't want you fighting," Jake replied, a protective instinct that had defined his role from the start. "I want you safe, out of danger, able to eventually testify without having to carry additional combat trauma. And I want you alive," she replied with equal intensity. "So if that means fighting alongside you, instead of being passively protected while you sacrifice yourself, then that's what I'll do. Non-negotiable." He turned him around physically to face him, forcing eye contact he had been avoiding. "Jake, you took this on for me. For family you didn't even know, whom you had no obligation to protect. Not because your badge demanded it or protocol dictated it, but because you understood something fundamental, that I couldn't live in constant terror for them, that my safety was inseparable from theirs, that... Nobody has ever done anything like that for me. Never. In a lifetime of learning to be nobody has understood that strength doesn't mean not needing anyone. I did it because you matter," Jake said with a simplicity that carried a weight of feeling that simple words could barely contain. "Because the idea of you destroyed physically through murder, or psychologically through terror or guilt over a wounded family is intolerable in ways that transcend any professional consideration. And because... double quotes." He paused, his next words a conscious choice of complete vulnerability. "Because I love you." I didn't plan it. Honestly, I tried not to, because I know it complicates everything protector-protected dynamics. Relationship ethics during active investigation, risk of emotional commitment affecting judgment. But it's true nonetheless. And when you truly love someone, you protect what they love, because their pain is your pain, because their joy is your joy, because you can't separate their well-being from the well-being of people connected to them. It was the first time the word had been explicitly spoken between them, not implied through actions or suggested through choices, but clearly declared, complete vulnerability offered without qualification or retraction. And its weight hung between them in the night air, changing something fundamental and irreversible. I love you too, she replied, not as an echo but as an independent declaration of feeling that had grown over the weeks. And that's why you need to understand something. I'm not going to let you do this alone. I'm not going to be the passive person you die protecting while I stay safe but devastated by loss. We're partners in this. In everything, in danger, in defense, in decisions about how to face what's coming. Not protector and protected, partners. And in that moment, on a cabin balcony under a starry sky, with the threat looming but temporarily distant, the dynamic between them fundamentally and irreversibly changed. It was no longer Jake as the designated protector and her as the vulnerable witness, dependent on his competence. It was a genuine partnership of two adults, choosing to face an impossible threat together, pooling resources, strengths, and vulnerabilities in a shared effort. In the days that followed that conversation, transformation manifested in concrete actions that proved words were not just declarations, but lived commitments. She proved to be much more than a vulnerable witness waiting to be saved. She helped strengthen cabin defenses by using medical knowledge to prepare a trauma kit that could handle gunshot or blade wounds, organizing supplies with an efficiency born from years in the ER where seconds mattered. She worked with Emily to establish safety protocols that were practical, not theoretical, specific evacuation routes, danger signs that didn't frighten Ethan but communicated urgency, a system of responsibilities where each adult knew their exact role if the situation escalated. Crucially, he taught Ethan games that were actually evacuation drills, forest adventure, where they practiced moving quickly but quietly, special hide-and-seek, where he learned to find hiding places and remain still, transforming trauma preparation into play that a child could engage in without carrying the weight of adult fear. Jake, observing her work, not only with competence, but with a naturally emerging leadership, with an ability to organize and motivate that he hadn't fully appreciated, realized that he had fundamentally underestimated her. Not vulnerability, which was real and which threats had exploited, but a strength that existed simultaneously, which came not from never needing help, but from actively choosing to protect, rather than be passively protected. Together, they were far more formidable than the sum of their individual parts. Jake brought tactical experience, knowledge of the terrain, and a network of contacts. She brought medical expertise, the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, and an understanding of psychology that helped manage not only physical defense, but everyone's emotional well-being. Emily contributed the perspective of a mother who had protected her son through hardship, a pragmatism that came from surviving loss. And that partnership, that conscious choice to face threats side by side, instead of maintaining a protector-protected hierarchy, deepened the connection between Jake and her in ways that normal circumstances, conventional dating, relationship development, through dinners and conversations without life or death, pressure would never allow, because they were seeing each other in moments of maximum vulnerability and tested strength. They were making impossible choices together. They were building trust, not through promises, but through consistent actions under pressure that revealed character in ways that words never could. Comment below. This makes sense to me when the transition from protected to genuine partners facing threats together not only changes dynamics, but reveals that real strength comes from shared vulnerability, not heroic isolation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a cruel irony in how victory against an external threat often doesn't come through the dramatic confrontation that cinema has taught us to expect, but through slow attrition, accumulated pressure, and the adversary's mistakes, rather than personal heroism. And for Jake and those under his protection, the final confrontation with the organization that had threatened everything revealed the truth about how real power works. Not through brute force, but through isolation. Not through public massacre, but through forcing surrender through unsustainable resistance. The final confrontation came not as a dramatic assault with gunfire and cinematic heroism, but as a slow siege that began Thursday morning, when Jake discovered that the communication lines he had established were dead. Not technically faulty, but deliberately cut, signals blocked by jammers that the organization had deployed around the perimeter. The organization, recognizing from previous attempts that a direct attack against Jake's defended cabin would be repelled with casualties that would attract the attention of authorities, opted for a different tactic that demonstrated worrying tactical sophistication: complete isolation. They cut off not only digital communications, but also escape routes. Roads leading to the cabin already limited by its remote location were blocked through convenient accidents. Fallen trees that appeared natural, but whose timing suggested orchestration. They created a perimeter at a distance that kept them safe far enough that Jake couldn't effectively engage. Close enough that an escape would be detected and intercepted, turning the refuge cabin into a prison. But, crucially, they didn't escalate to direct violence because they didn't want the public martyrdom that the massacre of a federal witness and family, including a child, would create. The media attention that would make their corruption impossible to hide. They wanted to force surrender through attrition by making resistance unsustainable. Supplies would eventually run out. Exhaustion would eventually compromise Jake's vigilance. And when defenses failed through attrition rather than assault, they could characterize what happened afterward as an unfortunate tragedy, not a deliberate execution. It was a brutal tactic in its simplicity and effectiveness, and it would have worked if the organization hadn't made a fundamental mistake. They assumed Jake was operating completely alone, that he had no allies beyond immediate contacts who were already compromised, that his rogue operation meant total isolation. They hadn't counted on the depth of the network Jake had built over 22 years, not through corruption or transactional favors, but simply by being a competent and ethical officer whom others respected, who had helped colleagues in critical moments without expecting immediate reciprocity, who had a reputation that made people question when orders against him didn't make sense. It wasn't a centrally coordinated heroic rescue, but an organic accumulation of small actions by multiple people independently recognizing that something was fundamentally wrong. Detective Mike Chen in Seattle, who had initially assisted, noticed inconsistencies in orders he received regarding cease unauthorized assistance, orders that came through channels not normally involved in local cases, and which were far too specific about something that should have been minor, prompting him to instinctively alert him. Deputy Sarah Martinez, in Jake's department, loyal, not out of blind obedience, but out of earned respect, questioned why superiors were actively blocking her attempts to communicate with Jake when he didn't respond, not just passively failing to help, but actively interfering in ways that violated normal protocol. Fidel investigator Thomas Wright, who had worked with Jake on a case years ago, acknowledged that leaks within agencies that had allowed an organization to compromise communications and track locations meant that official protocol was compromised, and that following the normal chain of command would endanger witnesses instead of protecting them. And when they converged, not officially through coordinated briefing, but organically through back channels, through personal connections that bypassed possibly corrupt hierarchy, through shared recognition that Jake wasn't the problem, but was exposing a problem, they discovered a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. Jake wasn't acting rogue, but was exposing corruption that penetrated much deeper than any official investigation had uncovered. The breakthrough came when Wright, working with Chen and Martinez, pooling information through unofficial channels, obtained evidence connecting senior members of the criminal organization to officials in positions of authority, not just passive leaks, but active infiltration and coordination that explained how the organization operated with impunity, how it had managed to compromise supposedly secure communications, and how it had blocked previous investigations. With that evidence, financial documents, connecting payments, intercepted communications, proving coordination, testimony from a low-level member willing to cooperate in exchange for protection that finally seemed credible, the case against the organization solidified in ways that completely transcended her testimony. It was no longer just about execution that she testified about, but about systemic corruption, about infiltration of law enforcement agencies. The operation that followed was coordinated not through an official hierarchy that was compromised, but through an informal network of officers who trusted each other more than they trusted their superiors. Arrests were made simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions, not just low-level members of the organization, but leadership, including corrupt officers in positions that had allowed the operation to continue. The siege around Cabin was broken, not through Jake fighting alone, but through coordinated force arriving from outside, surprising the organization that had assumed complete isolation. But victory, though real, came at a substantial cost that could not be ignored or minimized. Jake faced formal investigation for massive protocol violations, moving witnesses without authorization, using official resources for unsanctioned operations, compromising chain of custody, essentially operating a rogue operation that, even while revealing corruption, violated existing rules for valid reasons. Superiors who were not corrupt, but who valued order and procedure, argued that the end did not justify the means, that Jake had set a dangerous precedent where individual officers decide when to ignore protocol based on their own judgment. Investigations would take months. The outcome was uncertain, and even the best case would likely mean suspension and a permanent mark on the record. She would eventually have to testify in multiple trials, not only about the original execution, but about subsequent threats, about exposed corruption, a process that would take months or years, and would require reliving trauma repeatedly for jury hearings. Emily and Ethan would have to rebuild lives that had been dramatically interrupted, a child who had experienced fear, even filtered through games, who would eventually have questions about why they had to hide. A sister who had a life and a job in Seattle, but who now questioned whether returning was safe or whether the organization, even dismantled, had remnants that would hold a grudge. The relationship between Jake and her, born in crisis and strengthened through shared danger and impossible choices made together, would have to be tested in a normalcy that neither knew how to navigate, because they had met when she was vulnerable and he was protecting her. They had fallen in love during circumstances that accelerated intimacy, but also distorted perspective. And now they would have to discover if a connection forged in fire survived when the fire died down and normal life returned, with all its mundane complications. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a devastating truth about the aftermath of a crisis that no one prepares you to face. When the external threat that united you disappears, when the adrenaline that masked doubts evaporates, when you have to confront not only whether love is real, but whether you can survive the transition from survival mode to normal life mode. Discovering who you are as people, not just as protector and protected, not just as partners in battle, but as individuals with histories and traumas and futures, who now have to decide whether to intertwine or separate while they can. Still make a relatively clean choice, because there is a fundamental difference. A difference that cuts to the very essence of what love means and costs, between a man who promises to protect Eunice's words, a commitment that sounds heroic but can be performative, temporary, or conditional on specific circumstances, a man who protects not only you but the entire world that matters to you, who understands that your safety is not just about keeping your physical body intact, but about preserving your mental sanity, and the human connections that make life worth living. Jake had understood a truth that most people miss or never learn. You can't truly protect someone in isolation. You can't create a perfect bubble around an individual and call that complete security. Because humans are not self-sufficient islands, but complex networks of connections, family, friends, community, identity built through relationships, and threatening or severing those connections is threatening the very essence of who we are as much as a physical threat would. So he had protected everything, not only her as a witness, which was his job to keep alive, but also his sister, whom he had never met until a crisis forced a meeting. His 6-year-old nephew, who represented the innocence Jake swore to preserve, the integrity of the system he had faithfully served for 22 years by exposing corruption that compromised that system from the inside out, even when exposure would cost him the badge and career that had defined his identity completely. He had done it not because protocol demanded it, or because it was the safest professional path, but because he recognized that protecting her truly meant protecting her world. That love, if it was genuine rather than transactional or performative, required expanding the circle of care to include everything and everyone the loved one valued. And she, seeing that, processing the full magnitude of sacrifice, weeks after the immediate threat had passed, when she had the mental space to truly understand what he had risked and lost, understood something fundamental about the difference between love that is convenient and love that costs everything. True love is not just being willing to die for someone in a dramatic moment of heroism that movies romanticize, but being willing to live for them in much more complicated and less cinematic ways. It's being willing to protect what they love, even when you don't know those people, even when protecting them dramatically complicates life, even when it means expanding responsibility from 1 to 3. It's being willing to sacrifice the professional identity that defined youth, the badge Jake carried, the role as sheriff that structured his days, the community respects he had cultivated to preserve not only the life but the humanity of the person you love, to ensure they don't have to choose between survival and sanity, between justice and family. The immediate danger had passed in ways that seemed almost anticlimactic after weeks of constant tension. The criminal organization was dismantled, leadership arrested, low-level members cooperating or fleeing. Corruption that had allowed its operation exposed through investigations that Jake inadvertently catalyzed. Family was safe. Emily and Ethan could eventually return to Seattle or choose to start over elsewhere. The threat that had turned the child into a target was neutralized enough that a relatively normal life was possible again. But now, they faced a challenge that was, in many ways, more complex and terrifying than the physical danger they had survived. Discovering who they were when the crisis that defined them had evaporated, when they had to choose each other not out of necessity, born of extreme circumstance, but out of genuine will, born of knowing who they really were outside of survival mode. When the world returned not to danger but to normality, with social expectations, with judgment from people who viewed relationships born during witness protection as inappropriate or suspicious, regardless of context, it waited to see if love born in trauma could survive in peace. If the connection forged when the stakes were life or death translated into a sustainable partnership, when the stakes were much more mundane, but in many ways more difficult to navigate. Jake faced not only a formal investigation, but also the loss of the identity that had structured his entire life, his badge being suspended during review, a community that respected him now, divided between those who saw heroism and those who saw an unacceptable breach of protocol, and a completely uncertain future, because even if he wasn't criminally prosecuted, returning to law enforcement seemed unlikely, given how many bridges he had burned. She faced months or years of testimony in multiple trials, the process of reliving trauma repeatedly for audiences, rebuilding a career she had put on hold, navigating relationships where there was always the question of how much gratitude was mixed with genuine love, and whether dependence born of protection had distorted feelings in ways that only time would reveal. And both faced a question that neither could yet answer with certainty. When adrenaline completely disappears, when normal routine returns, when there is no longer an external threat forcing proximity and accelerating intimacy, does a relationship built in extraordinary circumstances survive in ordinary circumstances? Or do they reveal that what seemed profound was actually a product of trauma, that the connection was real but unsustainable outside the specific context that created it? It was a journey that was just beginning, not of partners forged in battle, but of partners trying to figure out how to translate that partnership into life, where battles are much smaller, but accumulating them is equally challenging. Of people who fell in love when she desperately needed protection, and he offered not only security but understanding. Trying to build a relationship where she no longer needed that kind of protection, but where they still chose each other nonetheless. With scars from what they survived, physical but mostly emotional, the way Ethan still occasionally asked, "Are we safe now?" in a voice that suggested his childhood trust in adult safety had been cracked. The way she jumped at unexpected sounds even when she rationally knew the danger had passed. The way Jake sometimes woke up with residual panic from nightmares, where he hadn't managed to protect everyone. And with promises, not formally declared but implicit in the choices they continued to make, of what they could become if they navigated the transition with the same honesty and commitment they had shown during the crisis. From witness and protector to equal partners. From people defined by trauma to people who survived trauma and chose to build something beyond it. From love born of need to love sustained by conscious choice, day after day, when choice would be easier than commitment, but when commitment offered the possibility of something deeper and more lasting. If you've made it this far with me, if you've felt every second of this journey where external threats forced a strong person to confront a vulnerability they couldn't defend alone, if you've understood the devastating difference between a man who promises to protect and a man who protects not only you but the entire world that matters to you, family, connections, people you love more than your own life, then you know this story is about something much deeper than romance, born in crisis. It's about recognizing that true love isn't just being willing to die for someone in a heroic moment, but being willing to live for them in much more complicated ways. Being willing to sacrifice the identity that defined you to preserve their humanity. Being willing to expand your circle of protection to include a 6-year-old child you've never met simply because the person you love couldn't. Live in constant terror for that child. And look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you want to continue exploring these journeys, where people discover that individual strength has limits when the predator attacks not you but the one you love, where the protector learns that truly protecting someone means protecting their world, not just their body, where love born of need must be tested in normalcy to discover if it survives when the need passes, then signing up here is the way to continue walking with me, because I create each script thinking of you, who understands that the deepest connections are revealed not when everything is all right, but when everything is falling apart and someone chooses to stay, chooses to protect, chooses to risk everything, not because they have to, but because the alternative is intolerable. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I want to know you're here. That Jake's choice to protect not only her but Emily and Ethan resonated with you, that you recognized the devastating moment when a predator shifts from attacking you to attacking those you love and forces an impossible choice between justice and family. Your comments tell me that it's worth investing in exploring the nuances of how love manifests, not through romantic words, but through expanding the circle of responsibility. How true protection means understanding that humans are networks of connections, not isolated islands. How the real test of a relationship isn't facing danger together, but choosing each other when danger passes, and choice is no longer a need, but a desire. And if this touched you in any way, if you've ever been forced to choose between your own safety and the safety of the people you love, If you've seen someone sacrifice their career or identity to protect not only you, but the world that matters to you. If you've understood that love born from trauma has to survive the transition to normalcy, or reveal itself as a product of circumstance, leave a like so I know. It's not about numbers. It's about knowing that what I create reaches you on the other side and touches something real. Something that makes you think about your own connections. About people who would protect your family, even without knowing them. About the difference between performative force and genuine commitment that costs everything. And because I know you don't want this story to end here, because stories like this demand continuation, demand to see if Jake and she navigate formal investigation and trial and reconstruction of identities, if their love survives when she no longer needs protection, but when they still choose each other nonetheless. There's a video here that continues in the same vein. Click and follow me there. Their journey from battle-forged partners to partners building a life in peace is only beginning, and our journey together continues until the next chapter.